Today we're going to talk about an exploration where we've come from, where we are, and what we're doing in South Africa's just energy transition journey. The panel discussion will provide an in-depth look at a range of aspects affecting the implementation of the just energy transition of the ground and includes perspectives from high-level advisors and developers. Key aspects include the lessons learned during rounds from the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, the REAP program as it's known in South Africa. We'll talk about stakeholder engagement and the importance of robust specialist studies, as well as thoughts on opportunities and obstacles ahead in South Africa. I have on screen from South Africa and then from Johannesburg, Tina Costas. Tina is the head of Norton Rose Fulbright South Africa Environmental Department and is a key member of the Norton Rose Fulbright Global Environmental and Social Governance ESG group. Tina is situated in Durban and is an authoritative environmental lawyer with significant experience across a range of environmental law related fields. She has a wide-ranging regulatory transactional practice focusing on energy, mining-related issues, and liability and water rights. Welcome to you, Tina. Nice to see you on the screen. Then I have my colleague, Matt Ash. Matt Ash is based in Cape Town. Matt is the head of the firm's energy focus group for sub-Saharan Africa and coordinates the firm's concentration in the sector across the region. He's situated in Cape Town, as I said, and Matt is a highly experienced and trusted advisor to clients across a wide variety of industries, including energy, transport, civils infrastructure, water and food security, and disruptive agri-tech projects. We have Anthony de Graaf. Anthony is a financial director at Atlantic Renewable Energy Partners and has been actively involved in the renewable energy industry since 2009. It's lovely to have you here, Anthony. He is also based in Cape Town and has been involved in the REAP program since round one. He and his team have developed 590 megawatts worth of successful REAP projects, as well as 400 megawatts of commercial and industrial projects. And I have alongside me, who've traveled to Egypt from South Africa, James Ross. James is a senior associate in the environmental department and is situated in our Cape Town office. In addition to his role as an environmental specialist, James advises on commercial transactions and regulatory compliance matters across various sectors, including renewable energy, upstream of petroleum, mining, and manufacturing. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Tina to lead us in discussion. Thank you, Tina.
Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome from Johannesburg. So mitigating the worst impacts of climate change requires all countries to decarbonize their economies, and South Africa is no exception. As set out in the JET framework, it is, and I quote, in South Africa's national interest to join the world in combating climate change in accordance, importantly, with national circumstances and development priorities. It's not only an environmental imperative, but an economic one too, as countries around the world shift toward low emission policies affecting global trade, as well as demand for goods and resources. In our panel discussion on the just transition journey, we will discuss the following. James will be talking us through a brief history of energy generation and distribution, as well as how government is addressing South Africa's energy crisis through the implementation of the IRP and how the REAP functions as a procurement mechanism. We then hand over to Anthony, representing Atlantic Energy Partners, which is a renewable energy development company, and he will share his lessons learned from developing projects from the REAP bidding windows and elaborate on how they navigate the early stages of development and solar and wind projects. I'm going to highlight trends and lessons learned in respect of environmental and social issues from a legal perspective in respect of various projects we've been involved in over the 20 years, which include the various REAP rounds, wind, solar, hydro, and CSP, emergency and risk mitigation rounds, looking at hybrid plants, gas to power projects, and green and brownfield projects relating to mining and industry, as well as some interesting case law. We'll see some interesting developments over time. And then I will hand over last and not least, looking to the way forward, opportunities and challenges. Matt's going to give us a snapshot review of where we generally stand on the energy transition, both internationally and from a South African perspective. Highlight some of the major opportunities that arise from the JET in South Africa and traverse some of the significant challenges in successfully implementing the JET. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to James. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tina. And thank you all for coming and for joining us today to talk about the transition. In order to fully appreciate the need for a just energy transition, one needs to understand the position in which South Africa finds itself with regard to energy security. And to do that, one needs to understand how we got here. To that end, we'll kick off with a broad overview of the history of energy in South Africa in terms of both electricity generation, as well as the development of the transmission and distribution networks which serve our citizens. We can move on to the next slide, please. Next slide. Again. Prior to the establishment of the Electricity Supply Commission, or Eskom as it's currently known, in 1922, electricity was distributed by municipalities and private companies. What triggered the need for a centralized electricity provider was the developing mine industry of the early 20th century. The gold and diamond mining boom, which kickstarted South Africa's mining industry, effectively began in 1870 with the Kimberley Golden Rush, and which went into hyperdrive in 1886 with the discovery of the world's largest gold fields in the Witwatersrand. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the first commercial gold mining operation also began in 1870 with the exploitation of the Maltina Indwe coal field in the Eastern Cape, specifically in order to supply energy to the Kimberley diamond fields. Enabled by this dedicated energy supply, Kimberley became the first city in South Africa to be illuminated by streetlights in 1882. This relationship between South Africa's mining industry and the energy sector continued, with 4 thermal power stations having been developed in Gauteng by 1915. The fledgling transmission system that grew up in this time also naturally developed primarily around mining areas. This is evident if one had to look at a map of our transmission system today, where the grid lines are clearly concentrated in the central and northeastern mining centers of the country. So essentially Gauteng and Mpumalanga, parts of Limpopo. These geographical quirks of our grid and how it impacts present-day project development is something that Anthony will touch on later. To feed these industrial needs posed by the developing mining sector and a country that was becoming quickly electrified in general, coal production grew rapidly over the 20th century. The world energy crisis in 1973 only served to increase global interest in and demand for South African coal. As a result, demand for coal in 1973 grew by 12%, and then again by 13% in 1974. The result of this is that during the 70s, coal production soared nationally to 74 megatons per annum, although that might seem like not so much compared to our current output of 235 megatons per annum, approximately. Despite the demand internationally for South African coal, most of the coal was still being consumed locally, which mirrored a rapid growth in installed generation capacity in the country. Next slide, please. So back one. Thanks. As you can see from the infographic on the screen, total installed capacity grew relatively slowly from 1,500 megawatts in 1950 to 4,000 megawatts in 1960. But this shifted into another gear after that, reaching 23,000 megawatts by 1980, and then finally 40,000 megawatts in 1990. And that is where, as you can see from the infographic, generation capacity essentially plateaued. Next slide. The flattening of the generation capacity curve was driven in part by government shifting focus to expanding access to electricity to previously neglected areas of society. As a result of this shift in focus, access did rapidly improve. For example, well, as an illustration of this, according to the World Bank, in 1996, electricity access in rural areas was only 23%, compared to 85% in urban areas. This stark contrast is made even more severe when you realize that the vast majority of the population was living in those rural areas at the time. Within a year, that had improved to 40% access by 1997. Generation capacity, however, did not develop in the same manner, which is something that was highlighted in the 1998 white paper on energy policy. The white paper in question predicted that surplus generation capacity would be fully utilized by 2007. These predictions came true when, with no significant increase to generation capacity in the intervening years, and with a grid under strain, South Africa experienced a grid overload and blackout in 2007, which led to the implementation of the first load shedding period. It's hard to believe that that was 15 years ago. Next. With the need to develop additional generation capacity, and in the context of an increasingly climate conscious world, the Department of Energy, now the Department of Minerals and Energy, published the Integrated Resources Plan in May of 2011. This IRP, called the 2010 IRP, concerns South Africa's forecast energy demands up to 2030 and sets out an indication of the country's electricity requirements, how these demands are to be addressed, and the cost of meeting these demands. The Electricity Infrastructure Plan, set out in the IRP, gives effect to the goals of the National Development Plan, which is the blueprint for infrastructure development up to 2030. It lays out the framework for future power generation in South Africa and identifies the need for South Africa to invest in a strong network of economic infrastructure designed to support the country's medium and long-term economic, social, and environmental goals. The IRP is a living document, subject to periodical revision by the department. A revised IRP, taking into account subsequent capacity developments, projections of electricity demand, and technology costs, was published in October 2019. The 2019 IRP updated the energy forecast to 2020 and provides for the procurement of generation capacity from a wide variety of energy sources. The breakdown of generation capacity by technology is indicated in this slide, which is it's an image taken directly from the IRP. And as you would expect, the majority of new generation capacity to be procured up to 2030 is from renewable energy sources. It is, however, envisaged that coal will still account for about 33,000 megawatts, or 43% of installed capacity at that time. However, this represents a fairly significant reduction from the coal-powered installation capacity peak of 45,000 megawatts. A tangible step towards this target was, of course, taken a week or two ago with the announcement that funding had been secured for the decommissioning of the Komati coal-fired power plant. In addition to the approximately 8,000 megawatts that has already been committed or contracted under the 2010 IRP, the 2019 IRP targets over 31,000 megawatts of new generation capacity that is to be added to the grid between 2019 and 2030. This accords with the ministerial determination promulgated in terms of the Electricity Regulation Act in 2020. And what that means takes us to a discussion of REAP as a renewable energy procurement mechanism. For context, and to add to what was said earlier by Greg, the Independent Power Producer Program was set up in 2010 to procure electricity from renewable and non-renewable sources from the private sector, and thereby contribute to achieving socioeconomic development objectives. The renewable energy leg of this program is known as REAP. From 2011 to 2022, there have been 6 bidding windows launched, which have allowed the private sector and independent power producers to invest in South African renewable energy market. To date, and if one also includes the risk mitigation round, which were launched at the end of 2020, about 6,422 megawatts of electricity has been sourced from 112 renewable energy projects across a total of 7 bid rounds since the first REAP project became operational in November 2013. To highlight what this means for the country, according to the IPP office, IPPs have helped South Africa to achieve carbon emission reductions of over 50 million tons, and in addition have saved almost 60 million kiloliters of water in that time. By June 2020, and so that is before the round 5 and 6 procurements, which happened last year and this year respectively, the REAP had attracted investment worth 209 billion rand, 20% of that being foreign investment. This clearly shows the importance of the REAP program in the context of South Africa's just energy transition. So how does this all work practically? In order to give effect to the IRP's procurement goals, the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, in consultation with NERSA, issues determinations in terms of the ERA. These determinations prescribe the amount of new generation capacity required and the technology from which that electricity is to be generated. So coal, solar, wind, gas, and so on. The standard process for the implementation of the IRP through these determinations is set out on the screen and can be summarized as follows. Firstly, the Minister issues the draft Section 34 determination in respect of that new generation capacity. NERSA, the energy regulator, then facilitates the required consultation and stakeholder engagement processes in relation to that ministerial determination. The importance of ensuring meaningful consultation during this process was highlighted in the ruling of the High Court in the 2016 Earthlife Africa case, which Tina will touch on later. After the consultation process is ended, the authorities then commence the tendering process by publishing a request for proposals, and bidders lodge submissions for their proposed projects in accordance with the requirements of that RFP. From that pool of bidders, the department selects preferred bidders, and these preferred bidders are given the opportunity to submit binding proposals for the development, construction, operation, and financing of their proposed projects. Finally, if all goes well, successful bidders will ultimately enter into power purchase agreements with Eskom. So before I hand off, as indicated in the previous slide, REAP has been a crucial mechanism for the procurement of renewable energy over the past 10 years. And the increased rate of procurement in rounds 5 and 6 is encouraging. The total procurement being sought under round 5 and 6 almost equals that procured under rounds 1 to 4 in totality. However, that does not mean that there aren't challenges. As of September 2022, power purchase agreements for the round 5 preferred bidder projects had only been signed out of 3 out of 25. That being said, I understand that the majority of the successful round 5 projects are targeting financial close by the end of the year, but it's something that will need to be monitored and ensured to trigger the success of the REAP program going forward. I will hand over to Anthony, who will talk us through REAP from a developer's perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, James, everyone. So, hi, everyone. Thank you very much for including me to be part of the panel today. As mentioned, I'm Anthony de Graaf, one of the founding members of Atlantic Renewable Energy Partners. And Greg, thanks for the introduction earlier, a bit about our company and our track record. And essentially, yes, we have been, as a team, involved in the REAP space since the very first bid window. So today, I'd just like to share a few of our experiences and learnings working in the sector as a developer. Next slide. I guess first and foremost, it is important for one to understand the role of a developer and what role we play in the sector. Essentially, we're here to facilitate market entry for new IPPs. And the second part of that will be us supporting our clients and our IPPs to provide new pipeline and market growth as and when required. We see ourselves as often as the first point of call for foreign investment and IPPs trying to enter into the renewable energy sector here in South Africa. So how do we achieve this as a developer? So it starts off firstly by identifying greenfield projects and doing our own screening of these sites and being willing to invest our own funds and capital into the development phase of these projects, taking early phase project risk. We continue to build a pipeline of projects all around the country. And we need to essentially very well understand the IPP strategy. And based on their strategy, we'll provide the IPP with options for projects that have already been de-risked and projects that can compete and be competitive in the REAP program. So overall, what is the impact of REAP from our experience? I mean, essentially REAP is the program that's allowed us to be a company. They created the marketplace, allowing us to operate in the sector. The REAP policies and requirements have brought and continue to bring a huge amount of interest in foreign investment from global IPPs. We see this regularly from new IPPs finding us, knocking on our doors and asking for new projects, new pipeline. The South African market size for renewable energy is huge, as James was pointing out from the IRP of 2019. And therefore, this is very attractive for global utilities to get projects of scale and to move quite quickly in line with the targets of what the country needs to achieve. This is all supported within a framework of a country which we would consider as an easy country to do business in. And that's, I would summarize by saying that we do have an excellent financial and legal framework in this country. We have access to world-class advisors, being legal, financial, technical, environmental. And this is all supported by project finance solutions that are very competitive and offered by all of our local commercial banks. Next slide. So essentially reflecting on, let's say, 11 years since bid window 1, we'll see that in the first 4 bidding windows of procuring over 6 gigawatts in just the 4 years resulted in significant learnings from all stakeholders. Renewable energy in South Africa is and will continue to be of significant scale, and this brings significant market awareness and interest from global IPPs. As part of the years of developing projects in the country, another outcome of this is that we've seen the environmental regulations being significantly strengthened. We have new guidelines being issued regularly, specifically for wind and solar projects. We have species-specific guidelines that one needs to consider during the development process or during your environmental impact assessment. And the level of detail and considerations for social and environmental impacts of the projects has drastically increased when comparing it to projects that we developed or that the whole industry developed from 7 to 10 years ago. One can clearly see that the environmental impact assessment processes are much more aligned with the IFC standards and the Equator Principles, which is being driven both by the IPPs and the lenders that are a critical part to the projects. One cannot discount the technological advancements that we've seen over the last 10 years. This has been remarkable in the renewable energy sector, particularly in the solar side of things. And we've also seen our lenders, all our projects are basically project finance. Our lenders are now getting extremely competitive as they are competing with each other to win market share. The result of all of these factors ends us in the position of having projects where we have very clear value for money tariffs. Each bidding window that we've participated in is always a surprise of how the low tariffs are being achieved by the respective IPPs. We're seeing a key amount of focus on socio and economic development, as this is a mandatory part of the REAP program, and as a critical part in allocation within the project plan. And therefore, you have robust, ready-to-build projects being presented in every bidding round. This is quite a remarkable feature, an outcome of the REAP program. Next slide. As in any maturing market, we would expect to see some challenges. And I just wanted to share with you today 3 topics that are always being discussed within our team and how we navigate them, being land identification, managing the environmental processes, and then your access to grid. South Africa is a big country with a lot of land available, but it's clearly not an infinite source. It becomes scarcer and scarcer and more constrained as more projects are being awarded. And we deal with both privately owned landowners and state-owned land. Each one do have their own challenges. And it really does come down to an education process to the landowners, who are the cornerstone and fundamental part of any successful project. With regards to the environmental considerations, we are seeing now that sites and projects in low sensitive areas are very rare find, almost never being able to source those anymore. And new projects are all needing to navigate high and medium sensitivities during the environmental impact assessment process. Now with that, you have the increasing number of guidelines which are needing to be considered. And the challenge with this is being well prepared as you go into each development of a project and trying to manage potential delays during the development process. We're also finding it to be quite a challenge to access experienced specialists, as this is a huge issue due to capacity constraints. And we simply do not have a large enough pool of specialists with experience in our country. As the marketplace is growing almost exponentially now again, there's just a shortage of well-qualified and experienced specialists in different factors and different disciplines within the environmental process. We're also seeing that the interested and affected parties, the INAPs, are trying to balance their time between monitoring and commenting on operational projects, as well as on newly awarded environmental projects. This means that we end up having meaningful engagement before the formal environmental process is often we're not able to do that, just from a pure capacity constraint of the NGOs out there. And this is largely due to a serious capacity constraint and limited access to funding for them. So there's always a willingness, and we do our best to engage pre-environmental impact assessment processes, but as we are often told, there's only so many hours in the day. And therefore, as a developer, we've had to build a very strong and skilled team that are able to deal with a lot of these issues before even going through the formal environmental processes. And at the end of the day, the net result with these points I've just mentioned is that we are seeing a large increase in appeals against environmental authorizations, particularly for wind projects. And the issues really are constraints, capacity constraints from stakeholders, relatively small pool of experienced specialists, and therefore having to use other specialists that might not be as skilled in certain parts of the country. And one cannot discount South Africa's incredibly rich biodiversity. And so it's always going to be a challenge with so many unknowns in the fauna and flora of the country. And what will the net impacts be for our wind and solar projects? So we're continuously learning and investing in new studies and just trying to understand what the final impacts will be of our projects. Next slide. The third and possibly one of the most challenging constraints we're facing with as a developer is to try and navigate our way through the countryside and still have short to medium term access to the grid infrastructure. As James mentioned, there has been a rapid increase in awarded megawatts, and this has placed material constraints on the grid infrastructure. If one has a look at the map here, you can see that the red circle that is where the bulk of the generation of our country comes from, the coal, Limpopo and Mpumalanga and Gauteng. And the grid has been built in a way to service where 80% of the demand for power is, which is the black circle where it lives. And there are good transmission power lines that feed through the countryside, the Northwest, Free State, and into the 3 Cape provinces. Then with the launch of the renewable energy program, one has found that the richest resource for renewable energy sits in the Northern Cape, the Western Cape, and Eastern Cape for solar and wind respectively. And so that has been the focus place for where all the awarded projects are basically sitting. And now this forces us to do 2 things. I mean, go find the next best resource with access to grid, or to invest in improving the grid infrastructure as much as possible and taking that cost onto the IPP and onto our projects. So we have to balance the timelines to develop new projects in areas where there's grid, or balancing when will the grid unlock in these resource-rich areas. I mean, it's very clear that, yeah, the Northern, Western, Eastern Capes are by far the richest renewable energy resources, which has the final impact on the lowest tariffs that one can achieve for our projects. We are, yeah, I mean, we as a developer and the IPPs do take into account as much as possible strengthening of the grid infrastructure. But when it gets down to significant transmission line strengthening, it has to be, you know, we're working with Eskom, and I believe Matt may touch a bit more on that challenge in his slides. On the next slide, I would like to give a very brief example of where we had an appeal against a specific project and how we managed to engage meaningfully with the appellants in order to solve it. This project is a solar PV project where we undertook the environmental impact assessment process. It was awarded the environmental authorization successfully. There was INAP, or Interested and Affected Party, engagement during the project's process. It was quite limited though, and there were very few comments received, and responses were given, but no additional detailed engagement with a few of the INAPs. Nothing material, so we thought. After the environmental authorization was awarded, we as the developer were approached by one of the INAPs, as well as an NGO they had brought on board, to raise a concern about a specific bird species and the loss of habitat that would happen due to the proposed solar farm. They had to lodge an appeal against our project, and the appeal merits, or the appeal was based on inadequate mitigations being proposed for the habitat loss of this bird species. So we sat around the table with this INAP and the NGO. You know, we explained to them our process and how we had complied with all the regulations and the frameworks, particularly the solar PV guidelines and procedures. And we explained to them what our bird specialist had recommended as the mitigation measure, which would, in their opinion, adequately reduce the risk from a high risk to a medium risk, so they could support the project. And then very importantly, we had to listen and understand the nuts and bolts of what the INAP was really concerned about. And essentially, it came out that there was insufficient data and knowledge about the species, insufficient studies existed at the time to actually understand what the impact of this habitat loss would be for the local population of the species of concern. We then, as the developer and supported by our IPP partner for this project, took cognizance of all these points noted by the INAP and the NGO, and we immediately mobilized a full team to undertake a thorough habitat suitability model for the species around the proposed solar PV site and within its greater area. It was difficult to find the right specialist. There was one person sitting in North America who had previously studied this bird in South Africa. Together with him and a few other independent bird specialists and many nights of data modeling, we were able to develop a robust habitat suitability model. We were able to ground truth it with independent people in the field. And we took this and presented it to the INAP and to the NGO. As part of the process, we also developed a very detailed and bespoke biodiversity management plan, which we committed to undertake over and above the normal biodiversity management plans that were already part of the EA process. And these were really focusing on the bird of concern during the construction and operational phase. And at the end of the day, we each listened to each other. They were cognizant of our project and what we were trying to achieve, and we, took seriously their concerns. And in this case, we had a very good outcome. We had a happy outcome, one might say, where the INAPs were satisfied with the studies that we presented, and they considered this to be adequate enough to protect the population of the species of concern. So, mutual respect of them being able to listen to us and our concerns and vice versa. We had an overall win for the advancement of both the solar PV project as well as the knowledge and therefore conservation of the species. And we were able to basically develop these models for this bird that did not exist. Where the NGOs would be trying to do this over a few years, they didn't have access to funding. And together, we were all able to agree on a path forward that would not have a net loss on the species population. So that was our experience. And the key point I say at the bottom here is mutual respect both ways. Often one can find NGOs or INAPs not being willing to engage with the developer. But in this case, there was definitely engagement from their side and vice versa, which worked well. So those are just my few slides, guys. Thank you for giving me the opportunity again to share that, and we'll remain online for any Q&A later.
Thanks, Anthony. And so my talk really connects with a lot of what Anthony has said. And I've summarized what I think are important recent lessons from environmental and social perspective. Of course, environmental regulation and the case law was developed in leaps and bounds since the 1990s. And there have been a lot of important developments along the way. It's going to continue to develop as we continue down the road to net zero. The general lessons or trends highlighted in recent matters in South Africa generally follow international trends. The fourth version of the Equator Principles, released in late 2020, recognized the objectives of the SDGs, and the changes reflected in the standards were on human rights, climate change, and biodiversity. These areas are clearly a focus for South Africa. The JET really is not only about carbon reduction. It requires an integrated approach with a focus on water, biodiversities, communities and stakeholder engagement and accountability and transparency. You'll see that Anthony's touched on that on the ground, engaging meaningfully with IOPs and the importance of the biodiversity. And I'm going to touch on it in my slides as well. So South Africa, the JET includes not only a massive rollout of renewables, which is reliant on the modern expansion and strengthening of the national grid, but also on the decommissioning and repurposing of coal-fired power stations and recognizing the role of transition fuels. All will require as a minimum some form of compliance to environmental legislation. And therefore, hopefully the lessons that I've captured below will provide some guidance for developers and investors. So I've started with the ending, and just to give a summary of where we're going, the lessons and the summary. And they seem quite simple, but they come up time and time again in the case law and in cases that we deal with on the ground. The first one is follow the rules and conduct relevant specialist studies. It seems quite simple, but you'll see from the two cases that we deal with, really, they didn't follow the rules. And also spend money up front, engage with the relevant specialist. Anthony touched on that as well. It's important to get the right specialist. And that follows on to my second lesson. Use experts with expert and local knowledge. Not always easy to find because of the vast differences in biodiversity across South Africa. But important that they have local knowledge and can identify potential issues early. Often if these are not identified early, that can derail or delay a project, which has financial implications. And then recognizing the importance of meaningful stakeholder engagement, accountability, and transparency. Anthony's case study is really on point in terms of that. Not just a tick box exercise, really engaging meaningfully with stakeholders and being transparent. And it's come through recently in a lot of the case law as well, the importance of this, and as I said, reflected in international trends. Okay, so I'm now going to deal with each in more detail. So if we can move on to the next slide. The first one is follow the rules and conduct relevant specialist studies. So this is the case of Karpowership. Karpowership South Africa, subsidiary of the Turkish Kardemir Powerships Energy Consortium, was awarded preferred bidder status under the risk mitigation program. It was therefore set to provide 1,200 megawatts of electricity for 20 years, and that announcement as preferred bidder was made in March 2021. The proposed project was to place 3 power ships along South Africa's coastline at Richards Bay, Ngqura, and Saldanha, and then to produce electricity from LNG that would then be wheeled onto the land and into the Eskom grid. So the EIA applications were submitted as required in terms of the environmental legislation, and the environmental authorizations were refused, which is the authorization allowing you to commence with your activities and your development. In June 2021, all 3 were refused on substantially the same grounds. So the first was non-compliance to one of the sections of NEMA, which involves public consultation and information gathering. So the draft EIA report, which is the report submitted before the final, was subject to review for less than the required 30 days. So there's your follow the rules. The rules weren't followed in terms of the relevant prescribed periods for public participation. And documents were also removed from the website. And there's your point about accountability and transparency. There was failure to comply with the regulations in terms of the NEMA regulations. The EIA report, the final report, which was handed to the authorities to consider, had new changes and information which the public had not seen and been able to comment on. And that's also a requirement in terms of NEMA. Public participation was not conducted in accordance with the regulations. Specified listed activities, so the listed activities that you require to get authorization for were not adequately identified. And the recommendations made by specialists were not followed. In many of the specialist studies, and that's relating to noise and marine, bird life, the specialists put in their own reports. They had limited time to conduct the studies. Their studies didn't meet the requisite standards, and they were also undertaken in the wrong season. A lot with bird and environmental, they have to be taken over a number of seasons to get meaningful results, and they were taken in a short period. So it was concluded that the minimum public participation requirements were not met, and the actual and potential impacts on the environment as well as socioeconomic conditions, and that was really related to small fisheries, could not be evaluated. Appeals were lodged by the applicants and the holders of the EAs, and they were dismissed on the basis that the gaps in information and procedural defects were material and fatal. So, that's really an important point in terms of the findings. I do believe, though, that they are redoing these studies, so we'll see where that takes us, and hopefully that lesson learned has been learned. The second case, quickly, is one we've referred to as Earthlife Africa Johannesburg versus Minister of Environmental Affairs. And this we refer to as the Thabametsi judgment. The Earthlife judgment concerns the assessment of climate change impacts in respect of a decision to build a 1,200 coal-fired power station in a province in South Africa. And in February 2015, the project company was granted environmental authorization for the power station. Certain submissions were made by the applicants, and in terms of an appeal, they contended that the authority was obliged to consider the climate change impacts of the power station before granting the authorization, and that there'd been a failure to do so. So if you look at the judgment, there was some some studies, but they said that they weren't enough to consider actually granting the environmental authorization, and that was then taken on appeal to the minister in terms of the regulations. And the decision there was that the climate change impacts of the power station hadn't been comprehensively assessed or considered in granting the EA, but notwithstanding that, the minister then upheld the decision to grant the authorization and amend the environmental authorization to include a condition that the project company would need to take a far more detailed climate change impact assessment report and to lodge it with the department for consideration. That was then taken on review by Earthlife, and the court held that the decision actually to grant the EA in absence of the CCIA is unlawful and irrational and reviewable on the grounds that the authority had overlooked relevant consideration. The decision to uphold the EA was based on a material error of law. We're actually presently dealing with a number of these in relations to different projects. Currently one on a challenge on a gas to power plant, where the challenge is really on the same grounds, that there's been failure to comply with NEMA in terms of alternatives, and that the CCIA is actually inadequate to determine what the climate change impacts are of the project in terms of how the project is actually going to be impact the environment and social issues, and be impacted itself in terms of the impacts of climate change. So the Tavametsi judgment actually sets out quite nicely the requirements of CCCIAs, climate change impact assessments, and the specialists use that with the requirements in terms of the EP and IFC standards to really determine what are the requirements. But as I said, there's a lot of challenges at the moment on whether those climate change impacts are sufficient to deal with the climate change impacts from different projects. Okay, my second slide, you can move, thank you. The key lesson, again, this is one that Anthony touched on, which I'm going to expand on, is use experts with expert and local knowledge and identify potential issues early. So this involved a nice case study for a CSP plant, which was in round 3.5 of the brief. And we act as advisors to the borrower in respect of submitting a bid response for a CSP plant. And the proposed plant is actually now, as you see, is a happy ending, is situated in the Northern Cape. So at the time of the assessment, when we received the instructions, the EA environmental assessment had been completed. And there was an appeal actually lodged by the holder of the EA, and I'll explain that in more detail. It was intended that the project would be developed in 3 phases, and adjacent to these 3 phases of the project is the Katu Forest. The Katu Forest is very unique. It's one of its only kind in the world. It's very large protected trees known as camel thorn or Vacella irrelovia. It's 4,000 hectares, one of its only kind in the world. It's been declared a protected woodland in terms of the NFA. And through the project development and us actually offsetting a certain part of the property adjacent to the phases, a portion of the offset area, which you'll see on the diagram, is that hashed area has actually been, is currently being declared, or there's intention to declare that as a forest nature reserve. So the EA strangely was issued with allowing three phases of development, and you can see that next to where the site layout is the yellow hashed diagrams of the 3 phases, and then you'll see the Katu Forest there. So the EA actually authorized the development of the 3 phases, but strangely enough, in one of the conditions of the EA provided that there had to be a sufficient buffer around the Katu Forest, which is situated to the right of phase 3, and that actually sterilized phase 3. The holder of the EA couldn't use phase 3 because of this condition in the EA. So it was quite a strange decision. And when we got it, as I said, the appeal had been submitted by the holder of the EA because they intended to develop phase 3. So at the next slide, please. At the time we were instructed, as I said, the appeal had been lodged. And when we looked through the documents, they had already engaged an EAP or an environmental consultant who had finished the environmental assessment. As I said, the EA had already been lodged and received. There was reference to a PAN, but there was no further information on wetlands. And I advised the client to undertake further detailed studies. We got a local expert, specialist expert. Again, this reference to having somebody with expert knowledge and local knowledge is important. And they did a detailed wetland delineation study was undertaken. And you'll see by that diagram, the blue portions, the blue little dots all over actually indicate the wetlands which were identified. So from going from a report that said there was nothing and no special, no wetlands, none of these areas, there were 24, which ranged from 0.1 to 2 hectares and total quantity of 15 hectares. They're referred to as endorheic pans, which are classified as wetlands in the South African legislation, but there's no outflow to an external body of water, and they only lose water through evaporation. They do have local and regional importance, and as I said, they are regulated in terms of the National Water Act. They were mostly found in the eastern portion of the property. So our solution was to recognize that buffer around the Kathu forest, and based on the wetland study, we advised the client to withdraw their appeal to develop phase 3. And it would then only result in the development of a phase 1, which would result in the loss of only 3 wetlands. And then we looked at impacts of further 5 wetlands within a 500-meter radius. So the phase 3 wasn't developed at all, and it was used as a biodiversity area. During this investigations and prior to the offset, we engaged with all stakeholders. The strategies, measures, the offset was agreed with the property owner, and the agreement was drawn up. We engaged thoroughly with the Department of Water and Department of Environment. And as a result, the second EA was issued. The project was awarded preferred bidder, and that area offset has now been declared a natural forest area to protect the forest, as well as a substantial biodiversity offset area. So really the lessons learned on that are early involvement with specialists and advisors who are experts and have local knowledge of the area. Identify potential issues early. It's not so easy to do, but if you have the right experts, that can be done. The project company originally had an environmental assessment practitioner who just wasn't aware of the area, and the project could really have been delayed or derailed. We had to, do a lot of these expert reports prior to bid, and deal with them in the bid response in such a way that we could still develop the phase 1 and 2 of the project, and then protect the biodiversity in terms of the wetlands and the offset area and the Kathu forest. And also specialists to raise main findings and issues early on. It's quite important, and that they don't just submit reports. They have to obviously remain independent, and there has to be some kind of independence. Well, there has to be independence with the specialist, but, if issues are raised in the beginning and issues early, like if this had been raised early on in the issue, there was quite a rush to get this done before bid and to make sure that everything was right. But I'm happy to advise that the project went ahead, and the area is now offset. The last one I'm going to touch on, and which links up really with what Anthony has said, is the importance of meaningful stakeholder engagement, accountability, and transparency. And really, we were seeing this across the board, not only in case law and case studies, but generally in terms of projects. Stakeholders are becoming much more aware of their rights. They're becoming much more aware of what should and shouldn't be done. in terms of projects. And there's no longer this idea that you really can just comply with the legislation as a tick box exercise. It really has to be a lot more meaningful. Where to draw the line is difficult, but it has to really be you are meaningfully engaging. So I just thought I'd touch on the JET framework, because there really is highlighted the importance of procedural justice, involving the most affected in decision-making process. It's really one of the main principles of JET, looking at distributive justice, restorative justice, and procedural justice. And procedural justice really is including engaging with communities open and transparently, and supporting active participation and collaboration. Okay, I'm going to quickly do with two cases, and then I'm going to hand over to Matt. So the first one is the Mining and Environmental Justice Community Network of South Africa versus the Minister of Environmental Affairs and other. So in this case, the court had to consider the validity of the decisions made by both Ministers of Environment and Energy and Mineral Resources in terms of the Protected Areas Act in South Africa to authorize a mining company to proceed with coal mining activities in a wetland protected area. And the respondents, who were the departments, asserted that in making their decision in terms of the Act and Protected Areas Act, they looked at all the authorizations which had been approved and a management plan, and in their view, the environment would be significantly protected based on looking at guidelines and conditions set out in the authorizations. The grounds of review on which the applicants sought to have the decision set aside included a lack of transparency and a lack of procedural fairness. They really weren't engaged, and there really wasn't enough transparency during the whole application process. And the court found in favor of the applicants. The decision to grant the mining activities in protected wetland area was set aside, and that was really done on the basis of a lack of transparency, no public participation, and the failure to adopt a cautionary approach. The cautionary approach is one of the principles in our in NEMA, our main framework environmental legislation, and which is an international principle. So interesting to see that brought through in the judgment as well. And the last but not least is the Sustaining the Wild Coast NPC and others. The recent judgment, I'll call it the Shell judgment, which was delivered on the 1st of September 2022. Briefly, the principal question in this matter is whether the grant of an exploration right for the exploration of oil and gas, which culminated in the need for a seismic survey along the southeast coast, was lawful. So in summary, an exploration was granted to use the seismic survey to seek out oil and gas reserves off the eastern coast of South Africa in terms of the mining legislation, and then numerous renewals of the exploration right were applied for and granted in 2017 and 2021. In October 2021, consulting at the instance of the operator of the exploration right gave notice to commence with a seismic survey along the Wild Coast pursuant to the exploration right and an environmental management program which had been approved. So the grounds of review, and it's far more detailed than this, but as a summary, as a result of the notice to conduct the survey, there were a number of applicants which sought an interdicting the respondents from undertaking the survey, pending the review of the decision to grant the exploration right and the renewal. The main grounds of review were very strongly that there was inadequate and flawed consultation and provision of information to interested and affected parties, and that certain material considerations relevant to environmental and cultural issues were not taken into account when making the decision to grant the exploration right and the renewals. Again, also briefly, although the judgment goes into far more detail, the court actually found in favor of the applicants and said that there was a failure by the relevant authorities to adequately identify and consult with affected communities. There was a failure to take into account relevant considerations of harm to marine and bird life, a failure to take into account considerations of community, spiritual, cultural, and livelihood rights, which really results is linked to our heritage law and requirements, and a failure to take into account relevant considerations of climate change. And as a result, there was quite a drastic decision to set aside Shell's exploration right and all the renewals. Shell and the Minerals Minister have applied for leave to appeal. So we'll see the story continue. On a thorough sort of examination of the judgment and the reasons, I think, there are issues with how the decisions were reached in terms of correct application of law and case law. But I think we'll certainly see that come out in the judgment. But the message is clear in terms of adequately identifying and consulting communities. And I think in that respect, it's quite correct. And the judgment was correct. As we've said, and as we've linked it to Anthony's case on the ground, it's no more just a tick box exercise if we've complied with the regulations and there's been a notice put up at site. There has to be really identification of what is this project, how is it going to affect the communities around it, and how do we meaningfully engage so that all communities and people are involved in the project and in the risks and opportunities, but they know, that there's not only a risk to them and a benefit to the projects. So that's my conclusion on the lessons, and I'm going to hand over to Matt now to discuss the way forward and our opportunities and challenges in the JET. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tina. Good morning, everybody. So it falls to me to try and tie everything together, what the previous speakers have traversed, and look at what is the energy transition looking like for South Africa moving forward. Look, there's been a lot of activity in this particular sector over literally the last few days. So what I hope to do is to give you a snapshot of where we are and where we're going that is informed by very recent developments. Okay, so just last month, DNV issued its energy transition outlook to 2050. I've given the reference at the bottom of the slide there, and I do recommend a close reading of this really excellent analysis of the energy transition globally. A couple of the main takeaways that I found from that report were clearly that electrical energy will be the mainstay of the energy transition for the next 20, 30 years. And as DNV said, electrical energy transition is growing and greening everywhere. Obviously, the driver there is that emissions must fall 8% per year to achieve a net zero by 2050. And one of the key sectors in which that can be achieved is the greening of electrical energy production. Significantly, DNV did indicate that hydrogen will supply only 5% of global energy demand by 2050, and that's about 1/3 of the need for net zero by that time. Again, just hot off the press, just yesterday, DNV issued its outlook on hydrogen up to 2050. I've not had a chance to read that report in depth, but just on a first conspectus, it looks really, really good. And again, I would encourage people to access that and read it. And we may, if we have time, touch on the question of hydrogen in the energy transition, particularly for South Africa at the end of my presentation. Next slide, please. Coupled with this, I'm delighted that Elisa de Wit from our Australian office, I think Sydney office, is in the audience, and she, together with others in our Australian office and Bloomberg NEF, did a global decarbonisation survey. So this was a survey done with organisations around the world, looking at their commitment to decarbonisation. And there were some really interesting results coming out of that survey. So most organisations surveyed have prioritised the reduction of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and there is a very big focus on procurement of renewable energy in order to achieve that. There was, again, amongst most organizations surveyed, a very strong interest expressed for direct investment in carbon abatement or carbon capture projects, which I found really interesting, as opposed to the next point, which is there seems to be less interest in long-term offtake carbon credits. And this seems to be driven by the fact that there are some change in law concerns, so that whether one can long-term bank carbon credits because of the potential changes in policy. However, carbon capture or carbon abatement projects are what they are. And once you've got the kit, you're going to capture the carbon, and so that you can then, provided of course the kit works, you can then bank those projects. A key takeaway from that survey, it's in the report, is that many organizations are prioritizing reduction of greenhouse gases from within their own operations. And we actually see this across the board, not just in relation to the formal procurements of electrical energy in South Africa, but also the private procurements, what we call the CNI, that's commercial and industrial projects. There was talk earlier about the mining sector that James mentioned. We're finding a very, very strong move by mines to procure private power on private PPAs across the board. That's not just for energy security, but also for decarbonization. Next slide, please. Sorry, before I move on, just to mention that on that previous slide, the source reference for that survey is given, and you can access the global survey at that link. All right, so where are we? So per our commitments under UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, and updated for the purposes of COP26, our nationally determined contribution in 2021 has been determined that our greenhouse gas emissions are to be curtailed down to 350 to 420 MTCO2 equalization by 2030. That's an ambitious target, but it's one that we have committed to. We've also committed to net zero by 2050. In the context of where we are from an energy production perspective, to achieve net zero by 2050 is also hugely ambitious, but we've committed to it. Then under IRP 2019, it has been recorded that we need to decommission up to 37,510 megawatts of coal-fired power. That means decommissioning or repurposing up to 13 coal-fired power stations by 2050. Now, on a country that is heavily reliant, up to 70% on coal-fired power generation, that is a hugely ambitious target, but we've committed to it. Next slide, please. So, the Just Energy Transition Partnership agreed to at COP26 between South Africa and foreign countries was a landmark step. And then just last week, so again, hot off the press, South Africa has issued the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. I'm going to refer to it as JETIP, if you don't mind, just to keep it simple. So JETIP is our plan to give effect to the JET partnership agreed to at COP26. Now, you can see that from JETIP, the funding requirements per sector from now until 2027, so that's a very short 5 years away, is the following. The electricity sector will need $47.2 billion to achieve the just energy transition that has been planned. For new energy vehicle sector, $8.5 billion. For green hydrogen, $21.2 billion. For skills development, $0.18 billion, and for municipal capacity, $21.3 billion. I'll just put a finger in the municipal capacity element there for a second, because that is such a key aspect of our just energy transition. You will notice that I keep on emphasizing the word just, and we'll come down to this a little later as we explore what the energy transition means. Sorry, that was a Freudian slip, and I'll get to transmission a little later as well, as Tony said. justice is such a key factor in our energy transition. And the justice is two things. There is the environmental justice that Tino has been mentioning, and there is also the social justice, which we will get into a little, as I said, a little later in the presentation, because it does speak to what our president has said, that in our transition, nobody gets left behind. Because of the implications of decommissioning nearly 40,000 megawatts of coal-fired power, you can imagine what the impact that is likely to have on jobs. So if we, just dealing with the municipal capacity element, what that speaks to is in relation to those areas where there are, the transition is going to affect local communities from a jobs and employment perspective, that there needs to be capacity building in other sectors, and that will fall within municipal areas. Next slide, please. Okay, just to unpack a little bit more on the costs of the JETUP in the electricity sector. So this is from the investment plan itself. So these slides come directly out of the plan. You'll see the coal plant decommissioning, 4.1 billion rand. Transmission, 131.8 billion rand. Distribution, 13.8. New solar PV, 233 billion rand. New wind, 241 billion rand, and new batteries, 23.1 billion. If I can just unpack this for a second. So you will see that transmission accounts for a huge aspect of this investment plan. Look, I don't think there's any secret that, and Anthony has touched on this earlier, that we are incredibly constrained from a transmission perspective. I mean, there were fabulous projects bid in round 5 of the renewable energy IPP procurement program that scored, they shot the lights out insofar as scoring was concerned, but simply could not be awarded preferred bidder status because there was no way to evacuate the power. The grid was completely constrained in those particular areas, and I'm talking about the Northwestern Cape. Now, that's a real problem in that if you're wanting to develop, and you see the new sector, new solar PV and new wind of those kinds of capacities, if you're talking about those kinds of values, you're looking at about 100 projects in each sector. That's 100 solar PV and 100 new wind at current costing. And Anthony will kick me virtually under the table if I'm wrong, but I think the numbers are about right. Now, that's 200 new major connections. If you're talking about, 75 to 100 megawatts of wind and 140 upwards of solar PV. Well, perhaps the other way around, 140 upwards of wind and 100 megawatts of solar PV. So that's about 200 projects. There is just not a prayer that we are going to be able to evacuate that power or connect them to the grid as it is presently configured. So transmission, in my view, has to be a major focus in broadening and strengthening the network. I'll give a few pointers a little later when we actually deal with this particular aspect. As I've said, so those kinds of numbers, when you talk about solar PV and wind, you're talking about a total of about another 200 projects. In my view, there should be even more emphasis on battery storage to be able to smooth the intermittency that these various renewable energy projects impose or impinge on the transmission network. So I think that there needs to be greater emphasis on the battery storage element as opposed to other generators. Of course, however, one is always going to be constrained about price. This kit is expensive. and it's getting more expensive. As many will know, from a lithium ion solution perspective, the lithium price rose 500% between October 21 and May or March of this year. Now that simply sinks projects, especially when you've bid on a fixed tariff. So we'll get to the question of how does one respond to those kinds of price differentials or movements in looking to be able to procure new generating capacity. Briefly, Mpumalanga's just transition investment needs. Mpumalanga is the province where there is the most coal-fired power generation. And that is the province in South Africa that is going to be majorly impacted by the decommissioning of nearly 40,000 megawatts of coal-fired generation. So this is the reason why this investment need is articulated in such detail here. Could I go to the next slide, please? All right. So JETIP was announced last week, very well received. Here you have the comments from Commission President van der Leyden. It's the first of its kind initiative to accelerate the energy transition. President Macron, this is a benchmark. Treasury Secretary Yellen, this creates a new model for addressing the climate crisis. So, I mean, the JETIP really is a template for this investment that we are going to require here in South Africa, and we like to think can be used as a model for other countries. That said, I don't think that anybody will stick up their hand and say the template or the plan as it presently stands is perfect. I think that we all understand that there are going to be a number of challenges in crafting, molding, etc., to ensure that this aligns with everybody's expectations. And I'll get to that if we do have time from the hydrogen sector in particular. Could we go on to the next slide, please? So we've had a great start. And we will all know that I think about 2 weeks ago, the World Bank confirmed its commitment to 9 billion rands worth of concessional loans for the Komati decommissioning and repurposing. That decommissioning and repurposing involves solar PV, battery storage, and some further elements, the details of which will just slip my mind right now. But it is a great start for producing a template for the decommissioning and repurposing of our coal-fired power stations. So AFD and KfW, KfW have announced just last week 300 million euros each in concessional funding for JETIP projects. I think the details still have to be hammered out. National Treasury will receive those funds. I'm very happy to report that the JETIP confirms that there is a very strict structure that deals with how funds flow and are administered, because dare I say, unfortunately, in this country, we don't have the greatest track record for financial management. Then again, just last week, EIB announced a 200 million euro loan to DBSA, that's the Development Bank of Southern Africa, to support private IPP distributed generation renewable energy projects. Where distributed generation means is that the generators are remote from the off-taker. Private means this is going to be a private PPA. It's not going to be under any of the formal procurements. And so where the distributed generator stands, it then wheels the power across the transmission network. Just to understand that wheeling is a financial transaction, not a physical one. One isn't taking electrons injected at the grid to point A and taking off the same electrons to point B. It's a balancing exercise. But just to remember that. But that is a very encouraging support given to DBSA for these CNI type projects. Could we go on to the next slide, please? Okay. So forgive me for the reference to the well-known song, but it is really apposite in this context. As I mentioned, from a priorities perspective, transmission is absolutely key. Now, if one speaks to Eskom about strengthening of the grid, they say they're very happy to do so. They have the financial wherewithal to do so. They are finding that the particular stumbling block right now is the landowners. In terms of the legislation, in fact, landowners are obliged to give the national utility, which is Eskom, a 15-meter wide servitude across their land for any transmission lines that are required. But of course, that those servitudes have to be paid for on a willing buyer, actually willing provider, willing receiver basis. And what Eskom is finding, and this is a real problem, is that the landowners are in fact flexing to try and maximize the servitudinal payments that they believe they're entitled to. And this is really hampering our ability to broaden the transmission network. There would be cynics that would say, oh, well, the expropriation bill, it was intended to be an act, but it never passed muster, would have dealt with that quite efficiently on the basis that the land would be expropriated. The expropriator would be entitled to offer a price, but could expropriate nonetheless, and then it would be up to the landowner to either accept the price offered or take that on review. That hasn't passed muster, so that opportunity or ability to expand the grid has not transpired. So we're in a bit of a hiatus here, and we'll just have to see how that pans out. But it is extremely important that without the ability to evacuate the power, we can have the best laid plans from a renewables perspective, repurposing of power stations perspective, and a hydrogen perspective, dare I say. But without the transmission lines, you can't do anything. I think one of our major priorities is to make sure that our formal procurements adjust to commercial realities. The one significant difficulty that we have found, in particular, I speak of the South African Risk Mitigation IPP procurement program, was that input costs have risen dramatically over the intervening period, pending what in fact itself proved to be our hiatus, and that was the implementation of the preferred bidder projects, given litigation that was initiated by a particular aggrieved party. The difficulty is that the procurements do not take account of these kinds of delays, and in my view, these kind of commercial realities have to be addressed in the procurements to be able to take account of the realities that are on the ground, so that where a bidder, through force of circumstance, entirely beyond its control, has input costs that have just accelerated beyond measure, that in fact puts the project underwater from a feasibility perspective, the procurements need to take account of that. Then finally, from a priorities perspective, the imperative, as I mentioned before, no one left behind. Coal decommissioning could affect 135,000 jobs in total. This is under the RP 29 scenario 3 and 4, where 17.8 gigawatts of coal-fired generating capacity is decommissioned. There will be no justice in the energy transition if we decommission the coal And no account is taken of all of these people who fall to lose their jobs. So many a winding turn. What are the challenges? Current energy reality, 70% of generation in South Africa is coal-fired. So we're going to have to take account of, as I've mentioned before, of how do we transition from there in a fair and just manner. We do also need to take account of the fact that there are certain transition fuels and resources in South Africa that that the country needs to explore and exploit. Those would include offshore gas. We have massive resources of offshore gas on the southeast coast. And there is production rights now being exercised in respect of that. One needs to be very careful that just energy transition funding doesn't have preconditions against exploitation of those kinds of transitional fuels. Then there's another commercial reality. Sorry, there's an extra zero that's been added to this particular slide. It's incorrect. It's 70 million metric tons, and it's not an increase. It's an actual annual an annual amount. The exports since the Russian invasion of Ukraine have increased by about 25%. Now, I've given the flags of China and India there. Actually, the exports have increased to Europe, but the reality is that the expectation going forward is that China and India will continue and increase their import of coal from South Africa over the next 20 to 30 years. So that's a reality that we have to take account of. Next slide, please. So how do we deal with this from a justice perspective? And I'm talking about social justice. One needs to engage with communities, and this is what both Tony and Tina have emphasized. But in particular, in relation to the energy transition, when one engages with communities, one needs to agree with them what the appropriate measure would be to ensure social justice for those communities. So it has to be collaborative. It has to be engaged. Now, I've given a slide there of a very cool agrivoltaics project that was just announced last week by a German company. What it is that it's an arc of PV panels on rails that moves up and down an agricultural field, a farm field, to be able to ensure that parts of the field get sufficient natural sunlight. But then also there are rainwater harvester collectors on the sides of each of these arcs. The agricultural process is run by the local community. So it's farmed by people who are there on the ground. Power for the farming operations slaved from the PV plant, and water is harvested from the collectors. This is a great project, and I'm a very big proponent of agrivoltaics. And I personally would very much like to see that when you're dealing with collaborative initiatives to engage local communities, that things out of the box solutions like agrivoltaics are given proper consideration, even if it does mean that the energy rate is going to be or the tariff is going to be a little more expensive. And if I can just put a finger in the page there, just last week the court upheld Eskom's challenge to NERSA's determination, multi-year price determination, as a consequence of which Eskom and NERSA have reached an agreement, a settlement on how the price going forward from next year is going to be determined. We can expect a 38% increase in in electricity tariffs from next year if all of the things that Eskom has applied for are taken into account. There will be no clawback by Eskom for the year past because that's part of the settlement. But what it does mean is that where you start where you start from a pricing perspective, that we are able to build in a little bit of fat to still be below the Megaflex rate. Then from a meaningful and tangible perspective, really what these are meaningful is that there just has to be not a lip service paid to a retraining or a skills development or upskilling perspective, but to give people meaningful alternatives. And tangible is just that. It must have tangible results. The final word there, the focus of the average worker is to put food on the table today, not whether food can be produced at all in 2050. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. On behalf of Norton Rose, Fulbright, thank you very much for attending today. Thank you to the speakers for the prognosis for the future, Matt, for you, James, for taking us from the past, to Tina, and to Anthony for the development. Thank you so much, very much for your speaking today. I also thank you, and I'll be remiss in saying no thanks to NBI. We're very good members of NBI and for their attendance and for their help to us today. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending.
I also just want to hear her. Hi, Natasha, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Hi, may we test your video?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay.
Can you hear and see me?
Yes, we
Hello? Okay,
can start.
Can you hear me?
yes, I can.
Hi, Natasha. Lovely to have you with us. I can see you can hear us. Yeah.
Yes, we're all good on this side. Thank you. Good morning to everybody.
Okay. I think let's get going. And good afternoon, everybody, both here at COP27 and those who are joining online from South Africa and elsewhere. My name is Joanne Yarwich. I'm from the NBI and I'll be moderating this panel. I must tell you all that I feel more nervous about this panel than about any others at the COP because people who know me know that this is not an area that I have great knowledge in. So I'm hoping to also be informed and educated through the conversation. We've got a great panel today. Online is Natasha Viljoen, the CEO of Anglo American Platinum. I'm so sorry that you couldn't be here with us, Natasha. Next to me is Vuyo Katla, who's the Director and Executive Vice President for Strategy, Sustainability and Integrated Services from Sasol. Next to him is Deepak Patel, the Head of Climate Finance and Innovation from the Presidential Climate Commission. Then Dr. Dumisani Mthembu from the Department of Science and Innovation. And last, but definitely not least, is Daryl Wilson, who is the Executive Director of the International Hydrogen Council. So a fabulous panel of well-informed experts in the field. And in order to kick off, I want to ask a fairly, I suppose, general set of questions to the panel, and we'll go through the panelists one by one and then come back and explore the issues in a little bit more detail. And I think that over the past few years, there has been a lot of work done in South Africa around the potential of the green hydrogen economy. I think that we are all clear that South Africa has considerable assets in relation to its potential to invest in green hydrogen. That includes our country's experience and expertise in platinum group metals, our Fischer-Tropsch process, our natural resources, the fact that we've got wind and sun and land. We may not have as much water, but certainly our natural asset base. And I think also the beginnings of a very strong partnership between government and the private sector around green hydrogen. So I think taking all of that into account, the first question I really want to ask is, what are some of the opportunities and the challenges that we need to address as a country in order to be able to make this happen? And I'd really like to focus today's conversation around making it happen. I think very much in the context of previous conversations that we'd had at the South African Pavilion, but also in the context of seeing this as an implementation COP. So Natasha, can we start with you?
Thank you, Joanne. And I think you've probably started to touch on some of what's really exciting opportunities for us as a country. So let me quickly ask specifically around the opportunities for South Africa. Now, firstly, I think everybody in the audience would be very familiar with the challenges we have around energy security in our country at the moment and the impact that has on the broader economic realities of our country. We're also very focused on just transition in making sure that nobody's left behind, that we continue to be very socially conscious as we are very specific around the energy transition process. Now, you've touched on some of them, but let me quickly touch on some of the benefits in South Africa. Specifically around large-scale, high-quality renewable energy potential. Now, we need the power sector to decarbonize alone requires about 10 gigawatts of solar PV and wind capacity by 2050. And green hydrogen will need an additional about 100 gigawatt of renewable energy capacity with about 2 to 10 gigawatts by 2030. Now, the renewable energy development zones alone can hold about 900 gigawatt renewable energy capacity with premium load factors in South Africa. And it is, I think you've touched on the benefits of South Africa's natural resources. The average load factors in South Africa are amongst the best in the world and on par with some of the major competitors like Chile, Saudi Arabia, and Australia. And it is being frowned upon if I talk about the fact that we've got the potential to export energy out of South Africa. Now, in a period of time that we see rolling blackouts, people will, with the right reason, frown upon it and say, well, can we please just look after ourselves for starters and then consider the export potential in South Africa. And just for our own generation, the benefits in terms of economic activity is significant for us as a country, and driving that economic development that's so desperately needed if we consider the high unemployment in our country. And it's underpinning not only the just transition from a fossil fuel point of view, but further economic development potential for us as a country. The other thing is we do have sufficient land and synergies to solving for water security, as an example. Now, just 1% of South Africa land area would be enough to produce 10 megatons of green hydrogen. And we have in the red zones alone about 5.4 million hectares available. In addition to this, green hydrogen will reduce water requirements by about, if we consider 10 megatons a year of green hydrogen production, only needs about 31% of the current water that's used in coal-based generation. So it's increasing water security and making making desalination financially viable for us. So it's not only energy, it's also water. And then last but not the least, we've got our Sasol colleagues on the line, so I'm not going to, I don't want to step into their space, but we've got the technology, we've got the expertise in the country, we've got the Fischer-Tropsch process, you've touched on that already. We have existing assets and knowledge through our Sasol colleagues that will allow for this local beneficiation and will enable us to produce a product for export. So we have the opportunity through that to capture a portion of the global export market through green hydrogen or methanol or jet fuels that we know our colleagues are working on at Sasol. So as far as benefits are concerned and opportunities, I'll stop there, Joanne, and give some of my fellow panelists an opportunity to respond.
Okay, thanks. I think we'll go along the line, and so for you, maybe if you can come in first on the broad question of opportunities and challenges.
Thanks a lot, Joanne. Natasha has been quite helpful in really setting out quite a number of these opportunities that we have. And I think that you already also indicated the benefit around solar energy, the benefit in relation to wind energy, equally the benefits concerning the technology that we have. As you know, Sasol already produces a significant amount of gray hydrogen. And so it provides us with the opportunity to make that pivot into green hydrogen. And of course, when you start looking into that and around what we've already done with our technology, the Fischer-Tropsch technology, and the emphasis again there is the fact that it is agnostic to the source of carbon. And so that allows us also to take advantage around using green hydrogen to produce a number of products, whether it's green ammonia, green methanol, sustainable aviation fuels. So when you look into that, and already what we've already started doing, we've already set off with proof of concept studies with our electrolyzer in Sasolburg, and we're looking into producing about 3.5 tons per day of green hydrogen with that. And of course, that's something that's going to be kicking off already in 2023. So if you look into what we've already put in place, what we're capable of doing, working with partners, including how we can enable the decarbonization of hard to abate industries, including steel. And of course, we've already announced the partnership with AMSA, ArcelorMittal South Africa, around the production of green steel. So when you look into that, you can clearly see a strong case for decarbonizing South Africa, but more importantly, opening up into new value pools for growing the economy. And of course, if you look already, S&P Global last year indicated that the green hydrogen economy has an opportunity to create about over 350,000 net jobs within the economy. So when you look into that, you know that the case is strong for the pursuit of green hydrogen. Of course, there are challenges. There are challenges, some of them have already been mapped out in respect of the amount of renewable energy that's required. And of course, that links also to issues around the infrastructure that has to be put in place. You've got to deal with the policy environment. You've got to deal with funding. And it's helpful that we've got some of the people on this panel who could also draw into that. And it's also around, as I said, also dealing from an international trade perspective around looking into ensuring that you have mechanisms that remove the barriers of entry for green hydrogen and other green products that will be coming from South Africa from our repurposing of the assets that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. I'm going to take a step back and maybe address the issue that a number of people have raised in the South African environment. Why green hydrogen? And we are jumping into the technology issues. We are jumping into the natural endowments that South Africa might have to enable us both for domestic as well as for global exports to develop the green hydrogen sector. But I want to just take a step back. Our journey really started with our nationally determined contributions, which made a case for ambition in South Africa's decarbonization objective. I also come from the Presidential Climate Commission, which has put the notion of justice based on socioeconomic development, growth, and job creation firmly on the table. And I do want us to remember what the overarching rationale is for putting green hydrogen as a nascent, emerging, pioneering potential sector in our industrial complex as we look forward. The financing challenges, obviously, for an emergent industry are quite great, and I have no doubt that we'll address some of those challenges as we go forward. I want to start off with industrial strategy and make the point that South Africa is no newcomer over the course of its history to actually having experience in creating new industries. In fact, Sasol itself is a product of a very conscious choice made at a certain point in our history for a particular set of very strong strategic reasons to create it. Similarly, Eskom itself, at the very beginning of South Africa's industrialization and mining complex coming into existence, was in fact a very clear decision taken to develop this capability that would position us both for domestic and in the global environment in a competitive manner. I want to make a case that a similar thing is true for the hydrogen sector. While it might appear to be futuristic, not all of us, in fact, even I do not understand, even as a chemical engineer, the full scope of the technical issues pertaining to hydrogen generation. I do want us to remember that this is one of the areas that offers us opportunity as we move forward for domestic abatement of CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions to achieve our NDCs into the outer years leading to 2050, and then finally being endowed with the kind of natural assets that we have. It is a compelling set of reasons to explore the creation of the green hydrogen sector.
Thank you, Deepak. And Dumisani, I think you've heard three of the panelists, and maybe I think government, as I understand it and as I've known it, has been working for a very long time on the hydrogen economy. This goes back, I think, over a decade, actually. And in the current context, maybe how do the governmental initiatives and governmental support address, create opportunities and address some of the challenges?
Thank you very much. You are quite right. South Africa first explored this technology back in 2007, 2008, when we developed the hydrogen energy in South Africa. And over the years, we have provided funding of close to 1.2 billion for phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of this program. And we've also been able to see investment going also in the sector of higher education, where we have also created centers of competence to train our students, the young people, so that they can be employed in the sector. But also, I think we've also seen some successes where we've also seen some of the products emerging from the research innovation program that we have had, such as prototypes being developed, demonstrations taking place, as well as some companies emerging, which are also and products going to the market. I think if you look at the hydrogen success roadmap that we have recently adopted, it provides enormous opportunities to unlock economic opportunities for the country in terms of jobs, in terms of building capacity, and also making sure that we continue to invest in the sector to develop it and also to make it competitive for South Africa to compete in the global market. But I think we also need to look at our national system of innovation by its size, which is relatively small in terms compared to other developed countries. This means that in terms of resource allocation, we're not spending as much money as we're supposed to spend to support research, innovation, and development, which makes it a bit of a challenge for South Africa. But as a department, we've also committed to continue to support this sector to enable it to drive and develop further.
Okay, and we'll come back to talk a little bit more about how. Okay, so Daryl, having heard the views of the panel, maybe just to ask, are these challenges and opportunities similar to other places? Are they unique to South Africa? Maybe give us a little bit of an international perspective on it. Thanks.
Good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to join you today. The Hydrogen Council is a coalition of 150 CEOs around the world who are committed to advancing hydrogen as an energy vector, including Natasha, who's on this panel today, and Fleetwood Grobler, who's the CEO of Sasol. First of all, I want to congratulate South Africa for a very proud history in hydrogen. I've been working in this field for 15 years, and all that time I have known researchers, companies, and the governments taking leadership in this important field. But today around the world, we are all on a learning journey, scaling up this industry. And so South Africa has a wonderful head start because of all the historical work. a wonderful place on the map because of the natural endowment of resources. But I think even more importantly, leadership, which is committed to taking action, both Anglo-American and Sasol, I know them because they're members of the council. I see a strong pattern of taking action and indeed moving into implementation, as we've been talking about at this COP. And then also Natasha's a very strong voice around the world, together with the council, about the important issues of social justice and environmental justice. And I think South Africa has something to teach the rest of the world in this important area as well. So it's a real pleasure to join with you and to participate with one of the strong leaders in the world in hydrogen.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And I think, thank you very much for that. And I think now as we move forward, let's talk about how we're going to take this forward, how we're going to advance it, how we're really going to build this into a major economic sector in the country. And maybe Natasha, if I can start with you, and I think essentially ask two questions. And firstly, I mean, Anglo has done a huge amount of research around the role of platinum group metals in the production of hydrogen. And if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, but also I think we were all so impressed by the launch of Anglo's hydrogen haulage truck. And not so much to talk about the truck itself, but about what it took in terms of partnerships and collaborations to get that off the ground. So over to you.
Thank you, Joanne. And I think that's such an important question, because I think one thing that is clear, if we consider the broader energy transition, because I think that's at the heart of all of our conversations, is how do we transition from an energy sector that is totally fossil fuel based to something that is entirely green. And I think one of my reflections when the penny dropped for me on the kind of interdependence and collaboration that's required for us to make this transition is just to consider when the first Ford motor vehicle was produced. And that's about 110 years ago. And if you consider that just as a point in time where we started to see the importance of energy and fossil fuels that developed over the last 110 years, as we've seen population growth, technology advancement, all based on fossil fuels, it just gives us a sense of the size of the transition that's required for us to move away in every aspect from fossil fuels to something that is sustainable in every aspect. And if we consider the interdependencies between supply chains, standards, policy, even our economic systems, trade routes, all of those needs to be considered for us to make this energy transition in a sustainable way. And I think it's also important because if we don't consider all of these interdependencies, we do stand the risk of making our problem worse before we can make it better. And I think that's at the heart of it. And Joanne, you said originally that you don't feel comfortable in this space. And I must say, just being amongst the great panelists here today, I don't know that any one of us are fully comfortable in this space and shouldn't be, because that allows us an opportunity to really learn from each other and collaborate between different sectors and different industries, private sector, public sector, to really develop what we need to make this energy transition in a just and a fair way across the world. And I think that's at the heart of how we think about it as a company. Now, firstly, as a company, we obviously have our own requirements and accountabilities. We need to decarbonize our own business. And whilst we have a broader targets and objectives in terms of how we make this energy transition, for us as Anglo American Platinum, there's two important aspects around green hydrogen for us specifically. The one is that a large portion of our footprint is our carbon footprint is from diesel fuels that we are using specifically in our open pit mines for Anglo American Platinum, but broader around the Anglo American group. To give you a sense, Anglo American Platinum, we've got 40 ultra class haul trucks in our mine at Mogalakwena, but across our business, we've got 400 of these trucks around. And Formida Smith will talk a little bit later around the detail about the truck. But it was around how do we decarbonize that portion of the business. It was also around, and if I'm allowed to, I'll tell a quick story on how the thinking about the truck came about. And I think it is also relevant to how we need to think differently around energy and our normal business models. That's very different to what we used to. As part of that decarbonization process, we considered building a solar voltaic plant at Mogalakwena. And considering our normal business models, certain financial parameters that we needed to meet, and he didn't meet it with the kind of cost involved at the time. We then adjusted our thinking and said, okay, let's not meet our financial hurdles, but just make sure that we break even, because there's a broader business requirement for decarbonization. And suddenly we were producing more energy than what we needed, which then brought a question about storage. And very closely linked to PGMs, of course, is, well, how do we use our own product in this process of storage, which brought PGMs to the fore, and PGMs obviously being used in either PEM electrolyzers for the generation of hydrogen, or in fuel cells to use hydrogen in various energy applications. And that is how the thinking around the haul truck was born. He said, well, now we've got hydrogen, what do we do with the hydrogen? And looking at one of our biggest carbon footprint elements, we said, well, why don't we build a hydrogen-fueled haul truck? And I think at the heart of that, your question is, how do we bring all of these things together? It was true collaboration between a number of experts in their field, integrating the interdependencies from the way we think about the energy balance around the truck, all the way to the mining system, and linked into a broader decarbonization strategy for us as a business. And then, of course, from there, we also saw it is one of the cornerstone projects for us as part of the Hydrogen Society roadmap that Dumisani has spoken about earlier, one of 4 projects to say, well, what does the hydrogen valley in South Africa look like? How do we use South Africa as a use case for us to produce our own green hydrogen and develop a hydrogen valley that will run all the way from Durban, from our Mogalakwena operations through Joburg into Durban, and have and draw on that localization opportunities. And I think Deepak has touched on the opportunity for local economic development that it brings along. So I'm hoping in there's a couple of components of collaboration, interdependence, and really thinking very differently around an energy sector that will have to transform in every aspect. And I'll stop there, and I hope I've answered your question, Jan.
Thank you. You have, and that's a fabulous story. And looking at a solution to your own challenges as a company, but ending up with something that is so much broader, with a much broader set of perspectives. If we could come to you now, Sasol has taken on some pretty ambitious carbon reduction targets, both by 2030 as well as by 2050. And maybe if you could talk to us a little bit about the role that hydrogen production plays in the way you see your business model unfolding, and also the way it will and can transform your operations. And I think linked to that, it seems to me, and I think building on Natasha's input, that ultimately we're going to need to have this ecosystem around hydrogen in South Africa that is an enabling one. And how in that process does Sasol see itself contributing to it? What can you add to the creation of that ecosystem?
Thanks a lot, Joanne. I think the first point really to make is that last year when we announced our Future South strategy, we essentially grounded it on visionary pragmatism, focus around significantly reducing our greenhouse gas emissions up to 2030 by 30% of our 2017 baseline, but equally committing very clearly to a net zero position by 2050. So we see, for example, if you take the issue of green hydrogen as essentially enabling that important pivot to the net zero position. The Hydrogen Council already itself has said it sees green hydrogen contributing 20% to emissions reduction, greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2050. So that itself speaks to the important role to be played by green hydrogen. It is always going to be about an ecosystem of collaborators. None of us can do it alone. It is important that we bring to bear all of the affected parties, because as already been indicated, when you look into the Hydrogen Valley, it's equally about decarbonizing supply chains. If you look into the N3 pathway in South Africa, if you decarbonize that has a significant impact to a contribution in respect of the NDC for South Africa. So that itself is reflective of what can be done. But as I've indicated, you need the collaborators, and they include also the state. We need to be able to come through with the right policies and measures that will enable this. If you take, for example, the countries like the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act, it's creating the space to promote and localize the production of green hydrogen in the United States. And we've got to be looking into what other measures can we work with government on and other players around creating similar incentives. Probably we will not have the fiscal space to do it at the scale that countries like the United States and Canada are doing, but I think we could still we have the benefit of always being able to open up ourselves into finding solutions. And so with the collaboration around on the policy side, on the research, and again around funding, and part of the funding is to equally look into a blended financing arrangements that also take into account grants that may have need coming into the fray. And so when you look into all of that, we do believe that this allows us to pivot into new value pools, bring it to bear new products. We've already indicated in respect of green ammonia and other green chemicals, and in that way enable a lot of hard to abate industries to also pivot into the new era, the net zero era that we all are aiming at.
Thank you, Vuyo. And I think both you and Natasha are painting a picture, Vuyo, of opportunity. It's an opportunity space. But Deepa, coming to you and from the perspective of the Presidential Climate Commission as a multi-stakeholder body, I don't think that all stakeholders in the PCC fold buy into this vision. And I think that they are certainly in the process of engaging on the JP, for example, on the investment plan. I think particularly there were comments that this is not, this is just something that is a private sector, for-profit business thing, and almost seeing it as being in competition with some of the social investments that need to happen. And I suppose my question is, what do we need to do in order to be able to have a national conversation around the green hydrogen economy that enables us to, I suppose, have build a consensus around its potential and its contribution in a way that the, I suppose, industrial developments, diversification, reindustrialization potential is well understood across the country.
Yeah. Thank you, Joanne. As you know, out of necessity in the course of negotiating the JET-P, it was late in the day that the investment plan finally got launched by the president. Of course, all of the naysayers leading up to that process would have gotten a hint that there were EVs in the investment plan, there was hydrogen in the investment plan. And I think as the PCC, perhaps the challenge now that the president has given us the job of socializing, consulting around the investment plan, the key challenge is going to be to look beyond the first 3 to 5 years of what the just transition means. I think the early stage of just transition necessarily has to focus on what the implications are for those workers, communities, and value chains that will be impacted by a decarbonization of the electricity sector. We all know that the real kick-in and value with respect to employment creation, jobs, and economic growth, especially in hydrogen, are going to come in the slightly later years. And for us, I think the just transition needs to be seen as a multi-decadal journey that not only gains momentum, but also deepens. At the heart of the just transition is, in fact, a solid socio-economic development plan, not only the amelioration of negative impact of the electricity sector. As we look forward to socializing the investment plan and to getting better understanding amongst all of the stakeholders who make up the Presidential Climate Commission, but also just as importantly, as we engage with the local communities in their areas, for example, Secunda, for example, in the individual mining areas that Anglo operates in, we can begin to create meaningful expressions that are understandable by those local communities about why it is existentially important, for example, for Sasol as a business, if it is to survive into the future, to make this transition, which if it didn't, by the way, the implications for the people around Secunda would be too horrible to contemplate, leave alone the business and economic impact of Sasol's potential demise. I think we have to start narrating the story of why we're embarking on this multi-decadal journey with justice, economic growth, job creation, and skills upgrades as a critical part of getting better livelihoods as well as more decent jobs. As we deepen, in essence, a systems transition to a new, greener economic future and a climate resilient society.
Thank you, and thank you for that. And maybe Dumisani, you know, that's a great vision that Deepak has painted. I suppose the question is how does government see itself intervening in terms of the creation of the policy framework, the enabling frameworks that allow and support this process to move forward? I think right across the value chain that we're talking about and the different industries that potentially all have a stake in green hydrogen.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. But firstly, I think I like the emphasis that I'm hearing from the panelists in terms of the need to partner and to collaborate with one another.
Sorry, hold it.
To the partnerships and collaboration that the panelists talked about, I think they are very critical for this to be successful. But I think, let me just say that, as you know, that we already now have this long-term vision, which seeks to rally all the stakeholders in terms of the hydrogen economy in South Africa through the hydrogen society roadmap. I think the important thing to emphasize is that it should not be seen as a government roadmap. This is a roadmap for all stakeholders and they should take ownership. Hence, we saw it necessary to ensure that we embark on an extensive consultation process with all the relevant key stakeholders so that they can provide input and also have a buy-in into it. But you will also know that in 2019, we developed a white paper, a new white paper on science, technology, and innovation, which also seeks to provide an overarching framework on how to deal with issues of research, innovation, and technology in South Africa. Currently, we are busy developing the decadal plan, which also mentions explicitly green hydrogen as one of the areas that we'll be focusing on over the next 10 years. So I think from a policy perspective, those are some of the things that we want to see happening. But obviously, the white paper must indicate that even the white paper should not be seen as a departmental white paper. It was adopted as a South African white paper where every single government department needs to play its role within the context of that white paper. So working through with the industry, private sector, and civil society, we want to continue to collaborate. Obviously, where there are policy issues that needs to be taken up, would be happy to hear about those areas so that we can also liaise with our key sister department so that we can deal with those issues that need to be tackled so that this sector can be taken further.
Thank you. Daryl, I suppose my question, what I'm wondering, two things. The first is really a question about whether we need almost an international policy framework around green hydrogen that will kind of level the playing fields, that will set the rules of the game, that will support the industry worldwide. I think particularly coming from a developing country perspective, I think there's a strong sense that the rules of the game are not necessarily even or level at this point in time. So how important is that? And what would it take to do it? And I think the second thing really from a South African perspective is that it seems to me as someone watching this industry that the entire world wants to get into the green hydrogen game with great levels of ambition all over the place. Where's South Africa placed in that? Thanks.
You're loading me up here. So first of all, on standards, very critical that we do have standards, especially around safety. And there's a long history of safety standards on hydrogen through ISO, and we anticipate those need to level up as we start using hydrogen in a more pervasive way. And then there's the important standards around sustainability. How do we develop the hydrogen economy in a way that's sustainable and light on the earth? And this is an area where we're looking for indeed a level playing field so that all economies around the world can make their place in hydrogen. Everybody has a hydrogen story. You just need to find it. And I think South Africa found their story quite a number of years ago in hydrogen, but South Africa and the technology leaders and the government leaders in Africa fully need to be part of the consensus process in establishing the standards around what is clean hydrogen, what are the thresholds that we need to recognize? How do we calculate those thresholds? How do we have a trading economy that operates on a level playing field? So I fully anticipate, because of the history that South Africa has already, that you will make a knowledgeable contribution to that consensus process. And I want to just share very briefly, giving you a little bit of a scoop on some information we'll share in the coming weeks. We spent the last 18 months on a study looking at the materials sustainability of hydrogen. You all know that there's only so much of these critical metals on the earth. And there's a very large endowment, of course, in South Africa in the PGM area. So over the last 18 months, we've looked at the vision for hydrogen from now to 2050. And we've asked the question, Is there enough platinum, iridium, titanium, ruthenium? And the answer is yes. There is sufficient minerals on the earth to fully grow into the vision that we have that hydrogen will indeed decarbonize 80 gigatons of CO2 and become 20% of final energy use. There's enough. That's a relief. That's good to know. And then we ask the question, can that be sustainably developed? And I think this is a very important contribution that South Africa will make. Really, it's a lot in your hands that we develop these resources and deploy these resources in a sustainable manner. And I think the leadership of companies like Anglo speaks strongly to that commitment. And then finally, the other good news is that the critical metals for hydrogen are already part of one of the most developed critical materials recycling programs in the world. As a former CEO in the sector, I know that I was able to return my used membranes and get back 92% of the value of the platinum, and the physical recovery was even higher. So I think this is 3 times good news. It's sustainable, it's sufficient, and it's recyclable. And as we develop those resources and steward those resources, South Africa has a very critical part in the responsible stewardship around this endowment on the earth.
Thank you. And I think that makes us all very happy that potential is there, that we have the potential to make that kind of a major contribution to what is, I certainly going to believe, is one of the critical solutions to global decarbonization into the future. I'm going to ask if there are any questions or comments from the floor. I want people to please keep it short. And then what we'll do is we'll come back to the panel for each panelist to have a minute to wrap up. So are there any hands, anybody who wants to contribute? I don't see anyone. Let's give it a minute. Huh? Oh, there's a hand online, apparently. Anyone online? I don't see any hands. No. Okay. All right. I'm presuming that you have all listened carefully and are convinced that you don't have questions that you want to ask at the moment. So let me come back to the panel, and starting with Natasha. From having heard this conversation, Natasha, your kind of closing thoughts.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you for my fellow panelists. It was really exciting and intriguing to listen to all of you. I think in closing, the challenges presented by the transition to a low carbon economy cannot be addressed by a single entity, either private or public, as I've said earlier. I think these challenges are significant. Some of them are long-term, such as the highest level of relative poverty, unemployment, and inequality worldwide, and the more recent effects of COVID-19. So coupled with this is the need to transition to a cleaner, greener, and more sustainable future in the face of our heightened energy crisis, if we just consider the geopolitical challenges that we have across the world. Ensuring South Africa's transition to an inclusive low-carbon future will require an ongoing constructive and honest discussion between government, labour, civil society, communities, and other key stakeholders around the inhibitors to investments and growth in South Africa. But we are really excited about the prospects presented by a number of the projects and announcements that's been made over the last while, and all will play an important part to help build South Africa's economic future, one that is inclusive and sustainable. So these projects represent over a third of the industry's electricity consumption, and it will substantially, I think, contribute to bridging the country's large electricity supply deficit. Now, for our business, Anglo American Platinum, Anglo American, we continue to drive solutions to climate change by sustainably mining. I think it's really important. It's the sustainable mining of metals and minerals needed for this energy transition, for a low carbon future. We're playing our role not only in South Africa, but certainly globally, driving standards, driving our own standards to ensure that sustainable mining. Our nickel products are instrumental to electrical vehicles and battery storage. Copper, essential for renewable energy technologies, such as PV cells and wind turbines. Our high quality iron ore contributes to the production of green steel. And then of course, our PGMs, powering the next generation hydrogen-based technologies that will play a role in all of these technologies that I have just touched on. Thank you so much, Jan, and thank you for the opportunity to join you here today.
And thank you so much for your time and your contribution. Vuyo.
Thanks a lot, Joanne, and thanks also to my fellow panelists. We're really excited of the prospects of green hydrogen, but more importantly, we're excited about what we can bring in to this discussion, to the developments that are going to be beneficial not only to South Africa, but to the world. At Sasol, we have got a purpose which is innovating for a better world. All of these reflect just the commitment we are making to providing solutions that will change the world, that will benefit the world, whether we're looking into spaces like sustainable aviation fuels, which of course are part of the derivatives from green hydrogen that we can already look at and are already working towards. But importantly, we agree with everyone that it's got to be a process that is inclusive, that will leave no one behind, that is just and totally equitable. And we want to work with all of our partners in finding solutions, in dealing with the challenges as we have them at the moment, but equally opening up ourselves to the idea that after all, with all the challenges we have relating to our carbon-intensive economy, we still have an opportunity for greening our economy and also contributing to a better world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. I think we've talked about the just transition and why the hydrogen journey is consistent with that. Unfortunately, we did not really get a chance to get under the bonnet as it pertains to financing and who's going to fund it. So I want to just use 30 seconds to say this has to be all of markets, all of financing that needs to find harmonization in the appropriate blended stack that takes cognizance of the fact that early risk financing is required for technology development. Early risk financing is required for developing at least the industrial scale pilots that can then be scaled up. The final point I want to make is that in the end, while this will be a competitive development across countries, we must be very mindful that markets are important. And in this respect, I just want to say that while it might not be seen to be associated with the global north, global south debate at this point in time, given our physical location, unless markets like the European Union start becoming a little more friendly and open by providing the kind of offtake that is required, we can forget about scaling up this industry. And I just wanted to end on that note, making a case for the global south being given a chance to also get into the game in a way that is supported.
And thank you for ending on that note, Deepak. I think a critical point.
Thank you very much. I think I just want to say that we have the long-term vision. We have the foundation through the HISA South Africa program. We have the natural resources that are needed to sustain the sector. I think that as a department, we will continue to use science, technology, and innovation as an enabler and a catalyst to drive the sector. And I think that moving together, we can achieve a lot more.
Thanks, Dumisani.
You know, I sometimes say hydrogen is a molecule of peace. And because there's access to the hydrogen story all around the world, we can all participate. But of course, it all comes down in the end to relationship. And so if we develop hydrogen in the context of mutual respect and mutual trust, then it can be what it is, a molecule of peace.
Okay, thank you. And that's a great way to end the panel. I want to thank all of you for your time and for your inputs. I think it's been a great conversation and clearly one that has got a long way to go and a lot of work for all of us to do together, not only here, but as we take this forward and as the rubber literally hits the road in a much greater and faster way. So thank you, everybody. Thanks to the audience. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Joanne. Bye-bye.
Then